I'm sorry, but I can't do this anymore.
Say it clearly, Madeline. Is it because I'm in this wheelchair, or because there's someone else?
How did you know?
Because you stopped looking at me like I was your future and started looking at me like I was your responsibility. Now answer me.
I didn't plan for this to happen.
That's not an answer.
I met someone who makes me feel alive again.
And I don't?
It's not that simple.
It is. You just made it simple.
I deserve a future too.
So I was just your pause until something better came along?
No, I never meant to hurt you.
But you did. So this is it?
Yes.
All right. Then go.
Weston.
But understand this. When you walk out that door, expecting me to still be waiting in the same place you left me. And don't ever ask why I never stopped you.
The hardest part wasn't waking up in a hospital bed unable to move my legs. It wasn't the machines counting every heartbeat or the silence that filled the room after the doctors walked away. The hardest part was watching the woman who had once promised to stand beside me through every season slowly erase me from her future, while she believed I had become a man who could never stand on his own again. If you had walked into that hospital room during those first few weeks, you would have sworn you were witnessing the tragic ending of a devoted love story. She cried beside my bed. She held my hand whenever another visitor entered the room. She kissed my forehead before leaving every evening. Yet there was one detail nobody else noticed. Every day her embrace became a little shorter, her smile became a little more rehearsed, and her eyes wandered toward the door as though another life was waiting outside. What she never realized was that every goodbye she whispered, every promise she quietly abandoned, and every secret decision she believed I would never uncover was becoming part of a truth I had already decided to uncover for myself. My name is Weston Hale, and this is the story of the woman who walked away because she believed I would never walk again. Before we continue, tell us the city you're watching from. We love seeing where our stories are reaching around the world. And if emotional stories filled with love, betrayal, unexpected twists, and unforgettable endings are your kind of escape, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's see how this story unfolds. When people spoke about Weston Hale before the accident, they rarely started with the company he had built, or the wealth that followed years of relentless discipline. They talked about the kind of man he chose to be when nobody was watching. Friends remembered him stopping to help strangers change flat tires during freezing winter mornings. Former employees remembered handwritten congratulations arriving at their homes after the birth of a child or the purchase of a first house. Neighbors remembered the quiet gentleman who shoveled snow from elderly driveways before sunrise without expecting anyone to know his name. Success had never changed the rhythm of his heart because long before he owned luxury offices overlooking downtown Seattle, he had grown up believing that character was the only possession nobody could steal. That belief guided every decision he made, including the day he met Madeline Brooks, a woman whose warmth could brighten an ordinary room, and whose laughter carried the comforting feeling of home. Their meeting happened in the least remarkable place imaginable, yet it became the beginning of a relationship that convinced everyone around them they had found the rare kind of love people spend entire lifetimes searching for. Weston admired how naturally Madeline connected with people, while she admired his quiet confidence and unwavering generosity. They seemed perfectly balanced, each bringing peace to the other in ways neither could fully explain. Friends described them as inseparable, and family members quietly placed their hopes on the future they appeared destined to build together. After 3 years together, Weston proposed during a private weekend by the ocean, choosing sincerity over extravagance because he believed genuine moments outlast expensive displays. Madeline accepted through tears, wrapping her arms around him as waves crashed against the shoreline, promising that no matter what life placed in front of them, she would never allow anything to separate them. Those words became the foundation of every plan they made afterward, from designing their dream home to discussing the children they hoped would one day fill it with laughter. Looking back now, people often ask whether there were warning signs hidden beneath those beautiful memories. The honest answer is that love has a remarkable way of encouraging us to notice every kindness while quietly explaining away every inconsistency. Weston believed trust required vulnerability, so whenever small concerns appeared, he chose understanding instead of suspicion. If Madeline seemed distracted after work, he assumed she was exhausted. If she canceled dinner because of unexpected commitments, he believed her explanation without hesitation. His faith in the woman he loved never felt like weakness to him. It felt like respect. He never imagined that respect would one day become the very thing someone else would mistake for blindness. Everything changed on an overcast Thursday afternoon that began like hundreds before it. Weston had spent the morning finalizing a charitable housing initiative his company intended to fund for military veterans, refusing to postpone the meeting despite his assistant suggesting they wait until the following week. He believed commitments mattered, especially when they affected families depending on those promises becoming reality. After leaving the office, he called Madeline to tell her he would arrive home earlier than expected because he wanted to cook dinner himself. She laughed softly and teased him about attempting another complicated recipe after nearly setting off the smoke alarms the previous month. It became the last ordinary conversation they would share before fate interrupted everything. Less than 20 minutes later, a delivery truck lost control after another driver ignored a red light, sending several vehicles into a violent chain reaction that transformed a busy intersection into twisted metal and shattered glass. Witnesses later described the collision as impossible to avoid. Emergency responders fought desperately to remove Weston from the crushed remains of his vehicle, while traffic stood frozen around them. By the time he reached the hospital, surgeons had already begun preparing for procedures lasting through the night. News of the accident spread quickly among colleagues, friends, and family, leaving everyone asking the same question: would Weston Hale survive? Hours later, the answer came with cautious relief. He was alive, but severe injuries had left doctors uncertain whether he would ever regain full use of his legs. Those words echoed through the hospital corridors before finally reaching Madeline, who collapsed into tears so convincing that everyone who witnessed them believed they were watching a woman whose heart had shattered alongside the future she once imagined. Nobody questioned her devotion as she remained beside his bed through those first difficult days. Nobody wondered whether fear sometimes disguises itself as loyalty while quietly calculating the cost of staying. And certainly nobody suspected that the greatest test waiting inside that hospital room had nothing to do with Weston Hale learning whether he could walk again. What nobody realized was that Weston had already made one quiet decision. If life had stripped away everything people admired about him, then he would allow time to reveal who was still standing beside the man beneath it all. He wasn't searching for sympathy, he was searching for truth, Ismina. It was about discovering who would still choose to stand beside him if they believed he never could. The first time Weston opened his eyes after the surgeries, the room appeared blurred by medication, exhaustion, and the weight of everything his body had endured. Familiar faces slowly came into focus. His older sister, Naomi, stood quietly near the window, refusing to leave even after nurses insisted she needed rest herself. His lifelong friend, Graham Mercer, sat beside the bed with both hands clasped together, staring at the floor as though willing himself to stay strong. And then there was Madeline Brooks, seated close enough to hold Weston's hand, her eyes swollen from tears, her makeup long forgotten beneath days of worry. To anyone watching, it looked like the picture of unwavering devotion. She whispered that everything would be all right, that she loved him more than ever, and that they would face whatever came together. Weston wanted to believe every word, because hope often sounds most convincing when spoken by the person your heart trusts completely. Yet even through the haze clouding his thoughts, something felt strangely distant. Her words carried comfort, but her eyes seemed to search the room instead of searching him. It lasted only a second before she smiled again, but that brief moment settled quietly inside his mind, refusing to disappear. He dismissed it as exhaustion, convincing himself that grief affects everyone differently. After all, she had nearly lost the man she intended to marry. Surely fear alone could explain what he thought he had seen. Over the following days, specialists performed countless examinations while therapists carefully measured every movement Weston could make. Recovery would demand extraordinary patience, but there were encouraging signs that remained known only to a very small circle of medical professionals. Although his spinal injuries appeared severe, several neurological responses suggested the damage might not be permanent. One afternoon, after another lengthy examination, Dr. Adrian Monroe requested a private conversation with Weston. Closing the door behind him, the physician spoke with careful optimism, explaining that while a full recovery could never be guaranteed, the latest scans offered considerably more hope than anyone had initially expected. With disciplined rehabilitation, there was a realistic possibility that Weston could eventually regain normal mobility. The doctor cautioned him against sharing that information too quickly, because expectations often complicate recovery. Progress would need to remain slow, measured, and protected from unnecessary emotional pressure. Weston listened carefully before asking a question that surprised even the experienced physician. He wanted almost everyone to continue believing his condition was far worse than it truly appeared. Dr. Monroe stared silently for several moments before asking why any patient would willingly choose such a burden. Weston answered with remarkable calmness. He explained that physical healing could wait if it meant uncovering truths that might otherwise remain hidden forever. He had built businesses by understanding human behavior, and experience had taught him that adversity often reveals what comfort successfully conceals. If the people closest to him truly loved him, nothing about his temporary condition should change their commitment. But if their loyalty depended on his strength, wealth, or independence, then this painful chapter might save him from spending the rest of his life believing an illusion. Dr. Monroe hesitated, reminding Weston that emotional experiments often produce consequences nobody anticipates. Trust, once tested, rarely returns unchanged. Weston accepted that risk without argument, because something inside him had already begun asking questions that refused to stay silent. The doctor eventually agreed to protect his privacy, limiting knowledge of the encouraging prognosis to only the essential rehabilitation team and Naomi, whose honesty Weston trusted without hesitation. When Naomi first learned about her brother's decision, she objected immediately. She argued that love should never become an examination, and warned that pain often causes people to behave imperfectly, without revealing their true character. Weston listened patiently, before gently reminding her that he wasn't searching for perfection. He simply wanted honesty. If someone chose to leave because the future looked difficult, they had every right to make that decision. What he couldn't accept was spending years beside someone pretending to love him, while secretly mourning the life they believed they had lost. Naomi embraced her brother tightly, tears filling her eyes as she promised she would respect his choice even if it frightened her. From that day forward, Weston stopped measuring people by what they said inside his hospital room. He watched what they did after they believed he had no future left to offer. Every visit, every excuse, every delayed phone call quietly became part of an answer he never asked aloud. Before Naomi left the room that evening, she turned toward the hallway where Madeline had stepped away to answer another phone call. Naomi couldn't explain why, but something about the increasing number of those private conversations unsettled her. Each call seemed longer than the last, and every time Madeline returned, she wore the same carefully arranged smile that disappeared the moment nobody was looking directly at her. Weeks passed, and the hospital gradually became a second home, filled with routines measured by medication schedules, rehabilitation sessions, and the quiet determination Weston refused to surrender. Visitors continued arriving almost every day during the early stages of his recovery. Business partners offered reassurance that his company remained stable. Employees filled his room with handwritten letters thanking him for years of kindness. Complete strangers, whose lives had quietly improved because of his generosity, mailed cards containing prayers and encouragement. Those moments reminded Weston that genuine impact often reaches farther than success ever can. Madeline remained present as well, but subtle changes slowly emerged beneath the surface. She began arriving later than usual, often apologizing for meetings, errands, or unexpected responsibilities that somehow always appeared at the last minute. She checked her phone more frequently during conversations, occasionally smiling at messages before quickly locking the screen whenever Weston glanced in her direction. Physical affection became less natural, as though every embrace required conscious effort rather than instinct. She still kissed his forehead before leaving, yet the warmth that once lingered afterward seemed to vanish the instant she walked through the hospital door. Weston never confronted her, because confrontation without certainty creates only arguments, not answers. Instead, he quietly observed, allowing time to reveal what emotions alone never could. He noticed details others overlooked. The expensive perfume she suddenly began wearing even on ordinary hospital visits. The elegant outfits replacing the comfortable clothes she once wore during long evenings at his bedside. The increasing impatience whenever therapists explained that recovery could take many months before any meaningful progress became visible. None of those details proved anything by themselves. Together, however, they formed a pattern that left an uncomfortable weight settling deeper inside his heart. One rainy evening, after Madeline had left earlier than usual claiming she needed to prepare for an important presentation, Graham stopped by unexpectedly carrying takeout from Weston's favorite neighborhood restaurant. The two friends spent hours laughing about college memories, old road trips, and the countless ridiculous mistakes that somehow become treasured stories with enough time. As Graham prepared to leave, his cheerful expression quietly faded. He stood near the doorway for several seconds before turning back toward Weston with obvious hesitation. Finally, he admitted there was something he had witnessed several days earlier that he hadn't known whether to mention. He had been meeting a client at an upscale rooftop restaurant across town when he noticed Madeline dining with a sharply dressed man neither of them had ever met. At first, Graham assumed it was a business meeting, but what unsettled him wasn't the dinner itself. It was the familiarity between them. They laughed with the effortless comfort of people who had spent far more than a single evening together. At one point, the man reached across the table and gently held Madeline's hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled in a way Graham hadn't seen since before the accident. Unsure whether there might be an innocent explanation, he chose not to interrupt them, but after several sleepless nights, the memory weighed too heavily to ignore. Silence filled the hospital room as Weston absorbed every word without changing his expression. He thanked Graham for telling him the truth, even though every sentence felt like another fracture forming inside a heart already struggling to heal. For the first time since the accident, Weston realized the greatest pain waiting ahead might have nothing to do with whether his legs ever carried him again. It might come from discovering just how quickly someone can begin walking toward another future while you're still fighting to reclaim your own. The morning after Graham's visit arrived with an unusual calm that almost felt cruel. Outside the hospital window, the city moved exactly as it always had. Commuters hurried through crowded sidewalks with coffee cups in hand. Parents walked children toward school. Delivery trucks filled the streets before sunrise. Life continued with remarkable indifference, as though it had never paused to acknowledge that one man's entire world had been turned upside down. Weston found himself studying those ordinary moments longer than usual, wondering how many people around him were quietly carrying heartbreaks no stranger could ever recognize. Pain has a peculiar way of teaching patience. It slows every thought until even the smallest detail begins to matter. For the first time since the accident, Weston stopped asking whether Graham had misunderstood what he saw. Instead, he asked himself a different question. If Madeline truly loved him the way she always claimed, why had she never mentioned meeting another man? There were countless explanations she could have offered if the relationship were innocent. Business, charity, networking, a mutual acquaintance. Yet she had chosen silence instead. Weston understood that secrecy often speaks louder than confession, because people rarely hide things they believe can withstand daylight. Still, he refused to condemn her without certainty. He had spent years making decisions based on evidence rather than emotion, and he would not abandon that principle simply because his own heart was involved. Whatever the truth turned out to be, he wanted to face it with clear eyes instead of wounded pride. Over the following 2 weeks, Madeline's visits became increasingly difficult to recognize as the same devotion that had comforted everyone during the first days after the accident. She still arrived carrying fresh flowers or coffee, but the conversations that once lasted hours now struggled to survive 20 minutes. She often glanced toward the clock mounted above the television, apologizing that she had another obligation she couldn't postpone. Weston noticed she no longer spoke about wedding plans, future vacations, or the house they had spent months designing together. Every discussion remained carefully trapped inside the present moment, as though tomorrow had quietly disappeared from her imagination. Whenever nurses encouraged Weston to celebrate small improvements during physical therapy, Madeline smiled politely but rarely asked questions. She no longer seemed interested in the details of his recovery. Instead, her attention drifted toward practical concerns. Insurance paperwork, medical expenses, the possibility of hiring permanent caregivers if rehabilitation failed. Weston answered calmly each time, pretending not to notice how quickly she accepted every difficult possibility without fighting against it. Naomi noticed it too. During one visit, after Madeline left the room to answer yet another phone call, Naomi sat beside her brother in complete silence, before finally whispering that the woman she saw today was nothing like the woman Weston had fallen in love with. Weston closed his eyes for several moments before quietly admitting that he had been hoping someone else would say those words first. Until that moment, he had feared his own disappointment might be distorting reality. Hearing the same concern from someone who loved them both removed one more excuse his heart had desperately tried to preserve. Several days later, another unexpected piece of the puzzle arrived through circumstances no one could have planned. Weston had been transferred to a rehabilitation center connected to the hospital, where patients spent long hours rebuilding strength through carefully supervised therapy. The center occupied several floors of a modern medical complex that also housed private offices, cafes, and conference facilities open to the public. One afternoon, after completing an exhausting therapy session, Weston rested alone near a quiet courtyard while waiting for Naomi to arrive. His wheelchair had been positioned beside a large glass wall overlooking the entrance plaza below. As he absent-mindedly watched people come and go, a familiar figure stepped from a luxury SUV parked near the entrance. Madeline climbed out wearing an elegant cream-colored dress he had never seen before. She wasn't alone. A tall man in a tailored navy suit walked around the vehicle before gently placing his hand against the small of her back. They exchanged smiles that carried an ease impossible to mistake. Weston watched as they entered the building together, laughing softly about something neither of them appeared eager to end. His pulse quickened, yet he remained completely still. He could have convinced himself they were attending a meeting, if not for what happened next. Before disappearing through the revolving doors, Madeline reached for the man's hand without hesitation. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like two people who had long since grown comfortable belonging to one another. Weston stared at that single moment until the doors closed behind them. He felt no anger, not yet. What settled over him instead was something far heavier: certainty. Hope, once weakened, had finally exhausted itself. Later that evening, Graham arrived after receiving a brief message asking him to stop by. Weston described everything he had witnessed without exaggeration, his voice remaining almost unnervingly calm from beginning to end. Graham listened without interruption before quietly admitting he had done something he normally would never consider appropriate. Concerned after their previous conversation, he had asked a trusted private investigator he knew through an old business client to discreetly gather publicly available information about the unidentified man. Graham placed a sealed envelope on the bedside table, explaining that he hadn't opened it because the decision belonged to Weston alone. For several long minutes, neither man moved. Finally, Weston reached forward and unfolded the documents inside. The first page contained a professional photograph beside a name that meant absolutely nothing to him. Preston Calloway, 42 years old, founder of a rapidly expanding investment firm, divorced, frequently featured in business magazines for his aggressive acquisitions and extravagant lifestyle. The remaining pages documented several public appearances over the previous month, where Preston had attended charity galas, exclusive restaurants, and private events accompanied by a woman whose face had been partially hidden from photographers. The images weren't perfectly clear, but they were clear enough. Weston recognized the coat she wore because he had bought it for her on their anniversary. He recognized the necklace because it had belonged to his late mother before he gifted it to Madeline as a symbol of welcoming her into his family. Graham apologized for bringing such painful information, but Weston surprised him by expressing gratitude instead. Lies survive through uncertainty. Truth, however painful, at least allows a person to stop imagining worse possibilities than reality itself. For the first time, Weston realized this was no longer about recovering from an accident. It had become a quiet study of the human heart. Wealth could attract admiration. Success could attract attention. But hardship had a way of introducing people exactly as they truly were. Weston carefully returned every photograph to the envelope before looking out the window at the fading evening sky. He finally understood that this was no brief lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate choice unfolding while she still visited him every few days, still accepted his affection, and still wore the engagement ring resting comfortably on her finger. That realization transformed the purpose of Weston's quiet test. In the beginning, he had only wanted to discover whether love could survive hardship. Now he wanted to understand how far someone was willing to go once they believed he no longer possessed the strength to challenge the life they were secretly creating without him. He instructed Graham not to confront Madeline, not to expose Preston, and not to interfere in any way. Every lie, every excuse, and every decision she made from this point forward would belong entirely to her. Weston wanted no traps, no manipulation, and no opportunities for anyone to claim she had been pushed into revealing herself. If she intended to leave, she would do so because that was the path she genuinely chose. If she intended to deceive him until it became convenient to walk away, that decision would also be hers alone. As Naomi listened to her brother explain his reasoning later that night, tears filled her eyes. She asked him how he could remain so composed after everything he had learned. Weston looked down at his motionless legs before answering with a quiet honesty that broke her heart. He said the accident had taught him something no amount of success ever could. Losing the ability to stand had shown him exactly who was still willing to kneel beside him. And before this chapter of his life came to an end, he intended to discover whether the woman he had planned to marry loved Weston Hale the man, or only Weston Hale the life she believed he could provide. By the beginning of the 3rd month, the rehabilitation center had become a place where every victory happened quietly. Weston no longer measured progress by dramatic milestones. Instead, he celebrated the slight movement of a muscle that had remained still the week before, the ability to sit upright without assistance for several minutes longer, or the growing confidence in the eyes of therapists who carefully concealed their optimism whenever other visitors entered the room. Behind closed doors, Dr. Adrian Monroe often smiled after each examination because Weston's recovery was moving faster than anyone had predicted. The strength in his legs was returning steadily, and with every session, he stood a little longer inside the parallel bars before lowering himself back into the wheelchair. Every new step strengthened more than his body. It strengthened his resolve to see the test through to the end. Revealing his recovery now would answer one question about his health, but waiting a little longer would answer a far more important question about love. The doctor reminded him repeatedly that rushing the process could undo months of healing. Weston agreed, not because he feared the physical challenge, but because he understood that another kind of healing still required time. The test he had begun wasn't finished. Every day revealed another piece of the truth, and he had reached the point where interrupting that truth too early would leave unanswered questions that could follow him for the rest of his life. Patience had become his greatest ally, even when patience demanded watching his own heart break a little more each day. Madeline's transformation had become impossible to ignore. She now visited only once or twice each week, always arriving with carefully rehearsed concern that sounded more like obligation than affection. She no longer reached for Weston's hand the moment she entered the room. Instead, she remained standing for several moments, speaking about traffic, work, or errands before eventually sitting down. Their conversations had lost the effortless warmth they once carried. Long silences settled between them, and whenever Weston asked simple questions about her day, her answers grew noticeably shorter. It was as though she feared lingering too long inside any discussion that might expose parts of her new life she desperately wanted hidden. One afternoon she mentioned that a former college friend had recently returned to Seattle and had been helping her stay positive through the difficult months. Weston simply nodded, recognizing the explanation before she even finished speaking. He knew there had been no college friend. Preston Calloway had quietly become the invisible presence occupying every space between her words. Yet Weston never challenged the lie. He thanked her for remaining strong and told her he hoped the support from friends made carrying such emotional weight a little easier. For a brief moment, guilt flickered across Madeline's face before disappearing behind another practiced smile. Weston realized something heartbreaking in that instant. She still possessed a conscience. She was simply choosing not to listen to it. Outside the rehabilitation center, another story was unfolding without Madeline realizing how many people had begun noticing the changes in her life. Family friends quietly wondered why she attended social events alone, despite Weston still recovering. Invitations that once included both of them were now politely declined on his behalf, while she arrived accompanied by vague explanations and increasingly expensive clothing that raised subtle questions among those who knew her well. Naomi remained silent through all of it, honoring her promise to Weston, but silence did not prevent observation. One evening she attended a fundraising gala where several prominent business leaders gathered to support children's hospitals. As she crossed the ballroom, her eyes landed on Preston standing near the stage with a glass of champagne in his hand. Beside him stood Madeline, wearing the engagement ring Weston had given her only a year earlier. They weren't behaving like strangers sharing a professional conversation. Their laughter carried the comfort of familiarity, and when photographers turned toward another guest, Preston gently brushed a loose strand of hair away from Madeline's face. The gesture lasted only seconds, but Naomi felt her stomach tighten. She quietly left the ballroom before either of them noticed her. Later that night, she sat alone inside her car, struggling to understand how someone who had once spoken so passionately about loyalty could now move through public gatherings as though the man recovering from devastating injuries no longer existed. She considered calling Weston immediately but stopped herself. He deserved honesty, but he also deserved peace while fighting the hardest battle of his life. The next morning, however, she realized withholding the truth would only prolong the pain. Weston listened carefully as Naomi described everything she had witnessed. When she finished, he thanked her for choosing honesty over protection. Pain, he told her, always hurts less than deception stretched over time. Meanwhile, Preston had grown increasingly confident, believing the future was unfolding exactly as he wanted. Wealth had taught him that most obstacles eventually disappeared if one waited long enough, and Weston Hale appeared to him as another obstacle gradually fading from the picture. Preston had no idea that Weston already knew his name, his background, and the growing relationship taking shape behind closed doors. He assumed he was competing against a broken man who could no longer offer the exciting future Madeline desired. During one dinner at an exclusive waterfront restaurant, Preston reportedly spoke openly about purchasing a luxury home in California and hinted that fresh beginnings often required leaving painful memories behind. Madeline listened quietly before admitting that she didn't know how much longer she could continue pretending everything was the same. She confessed she felt trapped between sympathy and the life she truly wanted. Preston assured her that nobody would blame a young woman for refusing to sacrifice her future caring for someone who might never walk again. Those words settled comfortably between them because they confirmed the justification Madeline had been quietly building inside her own mind for weeks. She no longer described leaving Weston as betrayal. She described it as accepting reality. The human heart has an extraordinary ability to rename selfishness whenever guilt becomes too difficult to carry. A few days later, Weston received an unexpected visit from the attorney who had handled both his business affairs and personal estate for more than a decade. Richard Ellison had known Weston long enough to recognize when silence carried deeper meaning than conversation. After reviewing several documents related to company operations, Richard asked a question that had been weighing heavily on his mind. Had Weston made any decisions regarding the legal arrangements connected to his upcoming marriage? Weston remained thoughtful for several moments before requesting that every wedding-related financial transfer remain exactly as originally planned. The trust funds, property agreements, investment accounts, and beneficiary documents would stay untouched for now. Richard looked surprised, gently reminding him that circumstances had changed dramatically. Weston smiled faintly before explaining that changing everything now would only alter people's behavior. He wanted every decision made around him to be based on what others genuinely believed, not on fear of losing financial security. Richard studied his client with quiet admiration. Over decades of practicing law, he had witnessed countless disputes fueled by greed, betrayal, and revenge. Rarely had he seen someone facing such personal heartbreak with this level of restraint. Before leaving, Richard placed a reassuring hand on Weston's shoulder and told him something he would never forget. Character isn't measured by how someone behaves when life rewards them. It reveals itself most clearly when they possess every reason to become bitter but choose wisdom instead. That evening, after completing another successful therapy session, hidden from nearly everyone except the medical team, Weston stood unaided for nearly 45 seconds. It was the longest he had remained on his feet since the accident. His legs trembled from the effort, sweat formed across his forehead, and every muscle protested against the strain, yet he refused to sit until Dr. Monroe finally insisted he had done enough for one day. As Weston lowered himself back into the wheelchair, a quiet realization settled over him. His body was healing faster than his heart. One carried scars that would eventually fade. The other was preparing to witness a decision capable of changing the course of his entire life. He sensed that moment was approaching. Madeline's growing distance, Preston's increasing confidence, and the carefully rehearsed excuses could not continue forever. Eventually, she would have to choose whether to remain beside the man she had promised to love or walk toward the future she believed offered greater comfort. Weston wasn't afraid of her choice anymore. What unsettled him was how calmly he had begun accepting the possibility that the woman he intended to marry had already made it long before she found the courage to say the words aloud. The conversation Weston had quietly anticipated finally arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the rehabilitation center windows as Madeline entered, carrying no flowers, no coffee, and no attempt to pretend this visit resembled any of the others. She remained standing for several moments before pulling a chair across from his wheelchair. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the floor, rehearsing words she had probably practiced countless times. Weston looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the previous months, offering the kindness she no longer believed she deserved. After several long seconds, Madeline finally admitted she couldn't continue living the life they had once imagined. She said the accident had changed everything. She spoke about how exhausting the uncertainty had become, how she had spent months trying to stay strong, and how she no longer recognized the future waiting ahead. Every sentence carefully avoided the one truth she feared saying aloud. Weston listened without interrupting, allowing every explanation to reach its natural ending. Then she quietly confessed there was someone else. His name was Preston Calloway. She claimed she hadn't planned for any of it to happen, insisting that loneliness and fear had slowly brought them together. She apologized through tears, saying she still cared deeply for Weston, but no longer loved him the way she once had. Finally, with painful honesty, she admitted the thought of spending the rest of her life caring for a man who might never walk again was more than she believed she could bear. Silence settled over the room. Weston lowered his eyes for only a moment before looking back at the woman he had once planned to marry. There was no anger in his voice, no desperate attempt to change her mind, and no accusation. He simply thanked her for telling the truth at last. He removed the engagement ring from the small chain where he had kept it since surgery made wearing jewelry impossible, and placed it gently in her hand. He wished her peace, sincerely hoping she would never spend another day pretending to love someone out of guilt. Madeline expected shouting. She expected heartbreak poured into angry words. Instead, she received quiet dignity, and somehow that hurt far more than any argument ever could. She left the room believing she had closed the most painful chapter of her life. She never once looked back as the elevator doors closed. The weeks that followed became some of the most demanding of Weston's recovery, but they also became the most freeing. Without pretending for Madeline's sake, he devoted every ounce of energy to rehabilitation. Every sunrise began with determination, and every evening ended with another small victory. The muscles that had once refused to respond gradually remembered their purpose. First came a few cautious steps between parallel bars, then a walker replaced the wheelchair during private therapy sessions. Eventually, a cane became nothing more than a temporary companion. Dr. Adrian Monroe watched with quiet satisfaction as medical predictions transformed into reality. The day Weston crossed the rehabilitation room without assistance, every therapist present stopped what they were doing. Some applauded, others wiped away tears they made no effort to hide. Naomi embraced her brother so tightly he laughed through his own tears, reminding her she might accidentally undo months of careful recovery. Graham stood nearby, shaking his head in disbelief, smiling wider than Weston had seen since before the accident. Yet despite reclaiming the ability to walk, Weston made one final request of the people closest to him. He wanted his complete recovery to remain private for just a little longer. Not because he wished to embarrass Madeline, and certainly not because he desired revenge. He simply believed some truths deserved to reveal themselves at the perfect moment. Character, after all, speaks most clearly when nobody realizes the final chapter has yet to be written. Nearly 2 months later, the Hale Foundation announced its annual fundraising gala supporting rehabilitation programs for accident survivors across the country. The event had always attracted business leaders, philanthropists, journalists, and community members whose generosity funded life-changing care for thousands of families. This year's gathering carried special significance because many believed Weston Hale would make his first public appearance since the devastating crash. Invitations spread quickly through social circles, and before long the entire city seemed eager to witness how the once energetic entrepreneur had adjusted to his new reality. Preston Calloway accepted an invitation without hesitation. Madeline accompanied him, wearing an elegant emerald evening gown and the confident smile of someone convinced she had finally left the past behind. Throughout the ballroom, sympathetic conversations centered around Weston. Guests whispered about how courageous he had been throughout his recovery. Several wondered whether he would appear in a wheelchair or choose to address everyone through a pre-recorded message. Madeline listened quietly, offering carefully measured expressions of concern whenever anyone mentioned his name. Preston squeezed her hand reassuringly beneath the table, convinced the hardest chapter of their lives had already passed. Neither of them noticed Graham standing near the stage exchanging a knowing glance with Naomi. Neither realized Dr. Adrian Monroe had also accepted a special invitation that evening. The room gradually fell silent as the master of ceremonies welcomed everyone and announced that the foundation's founder wished to personally thank those whose generosity had transformed thousands of lives. Every eye turned toward the curtains beside the stage. For several unforgettable seconds, nothing happened. Then a single figure emerged beneath the warm lights. Weston Hale walked forward with steady, confident steps, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. There was no wheelchair, no cane, no hesitation. His posture was strong, his shoulders relaxed, and every stride carried the quiet confidence of a man who had reclaimed far more than the ability to walk. The ballroom froze. Glasses remained suspended halfway to lips. Conversations died in an instant. Madeline stared at the stage as the color slowly disappeared from her face. Her breathing became shallow, and her fingers loosened around the champagne glass until it slipped onto the tablecloth. Preston blinked repeatedly, convinced he must be misunderstanding what he was seeing. Weston reached the podium, thanked the audience for their unwavering support of rehabilitation programs, and spoke movingly about resilience, hope, and the remarkable professionals who help people rebuild their lives after unimaginable hardship. Only after several minutes did he pause and allow his gaze to settle naturally across the audience. It stopped briefly on Madeline before moving calmly to Preston. There was no bitterness in his expression, only acceptance. Weston then shared one final reflection. The accident wasn't the test. Life gave me that without asking permission. The test began the day I realized my recovery could reveal something far more important than whether I would walk again. I wanted to know who loved Weston Hale, and who only loved the life they believed Weston Hale could provide. He explained that accidents reveal more than broken bones. They reveal hidden truths about relationships, friendships, and the values people quietly carry when comfort disappears. He admitted there had been a period during recovery when only a handful of people knew how much progress he was truly making. He chose those words carefully, never mentioning names, never accusing anyone, and never inviting sympathy. He simply said that while physical healing had exceeded every expectation, the greatest lesson came from discovering that genuine love never measures another person's worth by convenience, health, or success. Real loyalty remains when applause ends, when strength disappears, and when the future becomes uncertain. The room remained completely silent because everyone understood those words carried a story far deeper than the one being spoken aloud. When the evening concluded, guests approached Weston with admiration and heartfelt congratulations. Many celebrated his extraordinary recovery without ever realizing the emotional journey that had accompanied it. Madeline remained standing across the ballroom, unable to gather the courage to walk toward him. She finally understood that Weston had known far more than she ever imagined. He had never begged her to stay because love that requires pleading has already been lost. Preston quietly excused himself, recognizing that no amount of wealth or confidence could erase what had unfolded before his eyes. By the time Madeline found the courage to cross the room, Weston was already leaving through the grand entrance surrounded by Naomi, Graham, Dr. Monroe, and the people who had remained beside him when life offered them every reason to walk away. She called his name once. Weston stopped, turned with the same gentle kindness he had always shown her, and smiled. There was no anger left to carry. He thanked her for teaching him a lesson he might never have learned any other way. Then he wished her a life filled with the same honesty she had eventually shown him, even if it had arrived later than either of them hoped. Without another word, Weston turned and walked into the evening, every step reminding him that the greatest recovery had never been about his legs. It had been about his heart. Some people believe love is proven during life's happiest moments. Weston Hale learned that love reveals its true face only when everything comfortable disappears. The people who remain during your darkest season are never simply sharing your burden. They are showing you exactly who they have always been. And sometimes, losing the person you thought was your forever becomes the very reason you finally discover the future you truly deserved. If Weston's story moved you, take a moment and tell us where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how many different places these stories reach. And before you go, answer this honestly in the comments. If the person you loved lost everything overnight, their health, their career, and the future you once dreamed about together, would you stay or would you walk away? There's no right or wrong answer, but your perspective could help someone reading these comments today. If you enjoy emotional stories inspired by the complicated choices people make, stories that remind us what loyalty, love, and character really look like when life gets difficult, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more unforgettable stories waiting for you, and you won't want to miss the next one.